Forget the Romans. The most profound civilization to ever vanish from the earth didn't leave behind stone monuments, but a silence so deep it changed the very nature of human memory. You're about to hear the story of the Ethel, the accepted history of the Americas, the one you learned in school. Speaks of the Clovis people, a pioneering culture appearing around 13,500 years ago, defined by their distinct fluted spear points. They were the first, we were told, the ancestral root of all who followed. It is a neat, comforting narrative, like a tidy timeline placed neatly upon a shelf. But the earth is not a library shelf, and its history is rarely neat. Sometimes, the ground gives up an object that doesn't just challenge the timeline. It quietly dismantles the entire shelf, leaving only dust and the profound, cold silence of a question that should not exist. We begin our journey not in the bustling lecture halls of a university, but in a place far more remote, the high, desolate plains of the Great Basin, specifically a section of ancient, desiccated lakebed in what is now Nevada. Imagine a landscape where the horizon seems to stretch into the very fabric of time, where the air is thin and dry, and the only sound is the subtle shift of alkali dust. This is where Dr. Alistair Thorne, a quiet, methodical geoarchaeologist, made the discovery that would earn him scorn, then silence, and finally, a peculiar form of grudging respect, the kind reserved for those who see a ghost in the daylight. Thorne wasn't looking for people. He was mapping the geological uplift of the Pleistocene shoreline, tracking the recession of the ancient Lake Lahontan. He was looking for clay strata, not culture. But in the steep, crumbling bank of a runoff channel, a place exposed only after a series of unusually severe spring floods, he saw a color that didn't belong, a deep, resinous charcoal nestled in a layer of sediment dating back over 22,000 years. To understand the magnitude of this date, you must visualize the world at that moment. The colossal Laurentide ice sheet, an expanse of frozen water several miles thick, covered most of Canada and extended deep into the modern-day United States. The Bering Land Bridge, the traditional entry point for the first Americans, was either still submerged or completely blocked by impassable ice. In short, North America was a deep, frozen wilderness, an empty stage waiting for the human drama to begin. And yet, 22,000 years ago, something burned a fire there. The excavation was agonizingly slow, conducted in the kind of dry heat that makes both metal and sanity brittle. The charcoal was just the beginning. Beneath it, in the same deeply stratified layer, they found three objects. These were the Ethel's first whispers, and they immediately confounded every conventional archaeological framework. The first was a tool. It was not a Clovis point, nor anything resembling the crude stone flakes of earlier Eurasian cultures. It was a hand axe, yes, but crafted from obsidian, a volcanic glass that had been worked with an impossible precision. The edges were not merely sharp. They were ground and polished to a microscopic smoothness, almost as if using the jeweler's wheel, not a hammerstone. The flaking pattern, known as the ripple edge technique, showed a calculated artistry that should not appear for another 15 millennia of human development. Thorne described it in his notes as a silent scream of technological anachronism. The second object was a fragment of bone likely from an extinct species of bison. The bison antiquus, but it was the modification that mattered. Etched deeply into the surface were not simple hunting tallies, but a series of interconnected, non-repeating geometric symbols. Imagine the complexity of a modern circuit board, but rendered in deep, deliberate lines on ancient bone. These were not pictograms. They weren't crude representations of animals or people. They were abstract mathematical notations, symbols of relation, distance, and cyclical change. They spoke of a mind accustomed to abstraction, a thought process too sophisticated for a presumed, simple hunter-gatherer existence, but it was the third artifact that cemented the discovery, in the realm of the truly inexplicable. the object that seemed to defy the very physics of its Paleolithic context. They named it the Source Stone. The Source Stone was small, no larger than a clenched fist, and composed of a dark, fine-grained basalt not locally sourced. It felt oddly heavy, almost unnaturally so. It had been carved into a perfectly smooth, slightly flattened ovoid shape. Its defining feature, however, was a dense, microscopic filigree, a pattern of fine, hair-thin lines etched across its entire surface, forming a complex lattice that seemed to spiral into its center. When the lead geologist, Dr. Ilara Vance, ran a spectroscopic analysis, the results came back so unbelievable that they were initially assumed to be a contamination error. The lattice on the stone's surface wasn't a pigment nor a scratch pattern from use. It was a deliberate, metallic inlay, a trace-level application of platinum, an element that requires temperatures of over $1,770 circ text C dollar to work, and metallurgical knowledge far, far beyond any known culture until the Bronze Age. Let alone the Ice Age, the platinum was not merely on the surface. It was bonded into the basalt lattice at a molecular level, suggesting a heating and bonding process that modern science struggles to replicate outside of a controlled laboratory. The implications settled over the team like the vast, heavy silence of the desert night. If this platinum-inlaid basalt, this tool of impossible complexity, was genuinely $22,000 years old, and the radiocarbon dating on the adjacent charcoal was undeniable, confirmed by 3 independent labs, then the accepted timeline of human innovation in the Americas, and possibly the world, was fundamentally incorrect. It meant that a culture, which Thorne formally named the Ethel, from the Old English word for noble or primal, existed in North America at the height of the Ice Age, with a degree of intellectual and technical prowess that placed them millennia ahead of their contemporaries in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Ethel, based on these 3 artifacts, were not just early arrivals. They were a civilization of deep antiquity and profound isolation, who seem to have begun their evolutionary and technological journey not simply before, but entirely apart from the rest of the human story. Thorne, a man who cherished facts above all else, now found himself confronted by the terrifying beauty of an unknown truth. He realized that the greatest mystery was not how they disappeared, but how they managed to exist at all. The very sediments that preserved their fragments also testified to their absolute solitude. There were no intermediate layers, no clumsy early attempts. The Ethel simply appeared, fully formed in their quiet, impossible sophistication, leaving behind artifacts that were essentially time capsules of a future that never was. The world they unveiled was one of silent contradiction. A world where sophisticated geometry was etched onto the bone of an Ice Age giant, and platinum was worked by hands that should have been wielding only simple quartzite. This first silence, the deep, undisturbed layer of the earth, was not the quiet of absence, but the profound quiet of a forgotten people whose very existence was a historical anomaly. As the dry Nevada wind whispered over the dig site, carrying the dust of 200 centuries, it felt less like a wind and more like the slow, quiet breathing of a secret that the American earth had held close for too long. The simple facts of their existence were already too strange for a bedtime story. But the truth was only just beginning to surface. If the discovery of the ripple edge axe, the geometric bone fragment, and the platinum-inlaid source stone presented an archaeological paradox, the subsequent effort to reconstruct the life of the Ethel became an exercise in speculative, yet fact-driven, anthropology. We must now move beyond the cold facts of the artifacts and attempt to step into the world they inhabited. World shaped not by the mild climate we know, but by the relentless, crushing reality of the late Pleistocene Ice Age. The Ethel were not coastal people, and they were not woodland dwellers. They were a civilization forged by the harsh, windswept inland environment of the American West, surviving in the refugia of the mammoth steppe, a vast, cold grassland that supported megafauna like woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, and the extinct bison antiquus. Their survival depended on a deep, almost symbiotic relationship with this severe ecosystem. But their success hinged on a non-traditional adaptation. They were not merely hunters. They were specialist ecologists and miners. The location of the primary settlement, painstakingly mapped through trace elements in the soil and non-intrusive ground-penetrating radar, GPR, suggests that the Ethel lived in permanent, or at least semi-permanent, subterranean structures. Picture this, not crude dugouts, but complex networks of stabilized earthen lodges, strategically placed along the elevated moraines of ancient glaciers. The structure of their homes, known tentatively as kinetic dwellings, was designed for maximum thermal stability. Using packed loess, fine silt, timber framing scavenged from cold-hardy spruce and pine copses, and reinforced with the long curving tusks of juvenile mammoths. These homes were insulated against the -$40 circ Tex dollar winter winds. Inside these deep dwellings, the Ethel found consistency. Analysis of combustion residue shows they burned dried dung, richly available from the vast herds, mixed with resinous pine needles for fuel, creating a slow, steady, and low smoke heat source. Crucially, the air circulation within the dwellings suggests a calculated understanding of convection and venting, preventing dangerous carbon monoxide buildup, a technical sophistication that points to deep, practical knowledge of atmospheric physics. The source of the silence, metallurgy and the mountains, the platinum in the source stone remained the key to unlocking the true mystery of the Ethel. How did a Paleolithic people achieve advanced metallurgy? The answer, ironically, lay in their geography. Dr. Thorne's team traced the rare basalt and the platinum traces not to the desert floor, but to a narrow, high-altitude seam in a distant mountain range. The prevailing hypothesis is that the Ethel discovered a unique geological phenomenon, hydrothermal vents or hot springs, rich in dissolved heavy minerals, particularly platinum group elements, PGEs, which were deposited in a highly concentrated, elemental form within crystalline pockets. These pockets, exposed by ancient seismic activity, would have offered the Ethel access to platinum in a form that required less intensive refining than ore. More astonishingly, they must have utilized these same geothermal sources for their high-temperature processing. Imagine the scene, a hidden mountain crevice, naturally heated by magma, where steam and volcanic gases offered a stable, intense thermal environment. The Ethel, rather than creating extreme heat with wood and forced air, learned to harness the Earth's natural heat, a far more efficient and sustainable method. This suggests not a primitive forge, but a natural laboratory, where the minerals were not smelted, but perhaps pressure-fused or chemically reduced within the geothermal heat. A process far outside our current understanding of Ice Age capabilities. This geothermal knowledge also explains their unique approach to tool-making. The Ethel did not rely on the brutal percussion of conventional stone knapping. Instead, they appear to have used controlled, localized heat treatments, a process called thermal modification, to alter the structure of the obsidian and chert before working it. This made the stone far more predictable and allowed them to achieve the delicate, rippling precision seen on the ripple edge axe, turning brute force into meticulous calculation. The fabric of society, the mind and the pattern, the bone fragment with the complex geometric markings, speaks to the intellectual life of the Ethel. Their society seems to have been organized less around a chieftain or warrior caste, and more around a body of highly specialized sages or pattern keepers. Their knowledge base, which we term tide calculus, was an advanced form of mathematics centered on cycles, probability, and environmental prediction. They didn't just count. They calculated the rate of change. The geometric symbols found on their artifacts are not decorative. They are data visualizations. They likely tracked solar and lunar cycles, with accuracy far surpassing known contemporaneous cultures, essential for predicting the severity of the Ice Age seasons, animal migration flux, calculating the statistical probability and precise routes of mammoth and bison herds, enabling highly efficient, low-risk hunting strategies, geological stability, perhaps even predicting small, localized seismic events based on subtle changes in geothermal activity. Protecting their subterranean dwellings, their societal structure appears to have been remarkably egalitarian and resource-conscious. In a world defined by scarcity, waste was the greatest danger. The Ethel likely practiced a form of hyper-efficiency, where every resource, bone, hide, mineral, and energy was utilized for multiple purposes. The complex tools they created were not mass-produced. They were high-value bespoke items designed to last for generations, requiring meticulous maintenance and deep knowledge to operate. This deep integration of knowledge and survival led to an unusual pattern of existence, periods of intense, highly focused labor, geothermal mining, large-scale hunting drives, punctuated by long periods of meditative conservation, tool maintenance, knowledge transmission, and philosophical calculation within the stable darkness of the kinetic dwellings. They were, perhaps, a civilization that prioritized thought over action, using superior knowledge to minimize the sheer physical exertion required for survival in the Ice Age. Language and the memory lattice. The greatest challenge in understanding the Ethel lies in their lack of conventional art or written language as we know it. The abstract symbols are mathematically functional, but they offer little insight into narrative, myth, or song. The prevailing theory among the Thorn team suggests that the Ethel employed a highly sophisticated form of mnemonic architecture. Their history, their laws, and their myths were not written on scrolls or carved into walls, but encoded into the very environment of their dwellings and tools. The precise arrangement of stones, the geometry of their living spaces, and the specific patterns on their artifacts, like the platinum lattice on the source stone, were perhaps memory triggers or storage devices. The complex, spiraling pattern on the source stone may not have been for technological use at all, but rather a memory lattice, a physical representation of a dense narrative, or a complex set of cosmological laws, recited through touch and visual association. The knowledge was transferred orally, but anchored physically in these perfectly crafted objects, allowing for a level of precision and retention that transcends simple storytelling. The absence of traditional art and narrative may not signify a lack of culture, but rather a culture so intellectually advanced that they encoded the humanities into the mathematics of their survival. The Ethel's world, then, was not one of simple savagery or rugged pioneering. It was a dark, cold, and quiet sanctuary of intellectual supremacy, a hidden civilization that turned the crushing forces of the Ice Age into an advantage. They were masters of geothermal energy, pioneers of thermal metallurgy, and architects of mathematical abstraction. Their deep earth dwellings became silent, warm libraries where the greatest resource was not food, but knowledge that kept them alive for millennia, in a world that should have consumed them. This understanding of their world only deepens the central enigma, a people so profoundly adapted, so technologically secure, and so meticulously organized. Why did the earth swallow their echoes so completely? What event, what force could eradicate a civilization built upon such deep, sustainable knowledge, leaving behind only the cold perfection of their impossible tools? The stage is set for their apex, and the subsequent silence of their vanishing. The survival of the Ethel, as we have established, was not a matter of mere endurance, but of calculated intellectual dominance over the punishing environment of the Ice Age. Having secured their physical existence within the warmth of their kinetic dwellings, The Ethel turned their profound collective focus inward, reaching what we designate as the epoch of the mind tide, the zenith of their philosophical and cultural development. This period, which radiocarbon dates tentatively place between 18,000 and 16,000 years ago, represents the most complex and enigmatic phase of their history. To comprehend the mind tide, we must first understand the Ethel's central philosophical tenet, the principle of static harmony. In a world defined by violent, chaotic change, glacial movement, volcanic episodes, the brutal predation of the megafauna, the Ethel sought to find and maintain a state of perfect, unchanging equilibrium. Their advanced mathematical notation, the tide calculus, was not merely for prediction. It was a tool to identify the precise points of lowest entropy in their environment. Unlike later agricultural societies, which sought to violently reshape nature, the Ethel aimed for zero-impact integration. Their goal was to live so perfectly within the natural flows, the animal migrations, the mineral deposits, the geothermal cycles, that their presence left no discernible trace of exhaustion or disruption. Their tools, made of platinum and thermally modified obsidian, were designed to be so durable and efficient that they rarely needed replacement, minimizing the footprint of their resource extraction. Their philosophy mandated a complete merging of technological precision with ecological humility. This philosophy manifested physically in their most ambitious and astonishing creations, the resonance centers. These structures, known to us only through meticulous GPR mapping and a few deeply buried crystalline fragments, were not temples or palaces, but vast, subterranean chambers far larger and deeper than their residential kinetic dwellings. Resonance centers were constructed with an architectural precision that baffles modern engineering. Imagine a hollowed-out cavern, its walls lined not with decorative art, but with interlocking slabs of magnetite-rich granite. The floor, often covered in layers of meticulously patterned fine sand and silt, housed depressions where the source stones, like the one Dr. Thorne discovered, were presumably placed, the key finding at one of these sites, designated Nexus Ethel 7, was the presence of a massive, carved crystalline geode, likely quartz, at the center of the chamber. This geode, when analyzed, showed subtle striations and polished facets indicating deliberate, human intervention. The hypothesis is that the resonance centers functioned as collective meditation chambers and energy-focusing devices. The magnetite walls would have created a highly controlled magnetic environment, shielding the occupants from external electromagnetic noise. The central quartz geode, known for its piezoelectric properties, generating an electrical charge when compressed or vibrated, would have been used to amplify subtle biological or environmental frequencies. The mind tide, therefore, was likely a period of collective mental engagement. The Ethel sages would gather, using the source stones as physical anchors for their mnemonic architecture, and engage in sustained, deep meditative states. The purpose, we believe, was to achieve predictive transference, a collective mental exercise to model future environmental challenges, ice sheet shifts, volcanic ash clouds, changes in migration routes, and collaboratively determine the precise, minimal intervention required to maintain static harmony. It was not mystical. It was applied collective intelligence, facilitated by precise architecture and high-purity materials. They used the Earth's natural magnetism and crystalline properties to amplify their thoughts, turning their society into a vast, distributed supercomputer focused on survival. Within the mind tide epoch, the pattern keepers, or sages, rose to their greatest prominence. They were not priests in the conventional sense, but knowledge specialists, the living library and computational core of the Ethel. Their education must have been incredibly rigorous. The bone fragments found by Thorne suggest a curriculum based on hypergeometry, advanced mathematics for calculating resource distribution and flow dynamics, the tide calculus, bioacoustics, a deep understanding of animal communication and the specific sonic frequencies that influence herd movement, allowing them to redirect migration paths subtly and non-violently. Astro-chronology colon, an advanced calendar system, more accurate than any until the Renaissance, used not for ritual, but for predicting the gravitational and climate shifts induced by planetary alignments. These sages, marked by a characteristic, though yet unknown artifact or symbol, were responsible for maintaining the Great Code, the vast, living body of knowledge encoded into their mnemonic lattice and oral traditions. Their authority was not based on power, but on the irrefutability of their calculations. If the sages declared that the herd would move south in the next cycle, the entire community adjusted its movement patterns without question. Because the tide calculus had proven itself infallible for millennia, this reliance on pure, verified knowledge resulted in a society free of warfare and internal conflict. There was no need for violence when the solution to any conflict, resource scarcity, territorial dispute, could be derived through superior calculation and optimal planning. Their ultimate achievement was not a grand city, but the creation of a perfectly efficient and peaceful social engine operating at the highest level of intellectual pursuit. The apex and the seed of doubt, the epoch of the mind tide, was, paradoxically, also the period where the first structural flaws in the principle of static harmony may have appeared. While the Ethel were unparalleled masters of their local environment, their philosophy hinged on the idea that they could indefinitely maintain this perfect, low-entropy existence. However, the world around them was beginning to stir. While the Ethel were calculating the movement of distant stars, other, simpler human groups, the early ancestors of the later Native American populations, were slowly beginning their cautious, gradual migration down the open corridors of the continent, following the slow retreat of the ice. These were people of a different nature, less calculated, more adaptive, and utterly untethered from the Ethel's strict philosophical constraints. The Ethel sages would have calculated this impending demographic shift. They would have seen the inexorable entropy, the uncontrolled, unpredictable expansion of other life forms, approaching their calculated, static existence. This presented the greatest crisis of the mind tide. How does a civilization dedicated to perfect non-disruption react to an external disruption it cannot control or calculate? Did they view the approaching populations as a threat to their survival, or a threat to their philosophy? Did they attempt to communicate the Great Code, offering their knowledge of static harmony to the new arrivals, only to be misunderstood? Or did they realize, in the quiet depths of their resonance centers, that their hyper-efficient, non-entropic way of life was fundamentally incompatible with the chaotic, evolving nature of all other human life? This crisis marks the transition point. The mind tide was receding, leaving behind a choice for the sages. They had achieved the pinnacle of knowing. They knew the earth, the cycles, and the future probabilities better than any civilization before or since. Now they were faced with the ultimate question. What do you do when the perfect calculation dictates an imperfect conclusion? The subsequent, rapid silence of their vanishing suggests the answer they chose was as profound and mysterious as their platinum-etched tools. Their apex of knowledge led directly to their ultimate, calculated act of disappearance. We have followed the Ethel from their mysterious appearance, signaled by the impossible precision of their platinum-inlaid tools, through the complex security of their kinetic dwellings, and to the height of their intellectual pursuit, the epoch of the mind tide. We witnessed a civilization that achieved perfect harmony with the Ice Age environment, relying on advanced calculation and geothermal harnessing rather than brute force. They were not just surviving. They were succeeding at the pinnacle of sustained, non-entropic existence. And yet, by $16,000 years ago, the profound silence of their vanishing had begun. The most disturbing aspect of the Ethel enigma is not the complexity of their tools, but the archaeological vacuum they left behind. When most great civilizations collapse, be they Sumerian, Ramang, or Mayan, they leave an archaeological signature of decline: abandoned cities, mass graves, layers of ash from conflict, or scattered evidence of famine and disease. The decline is messy, tragic, and traceable. The Ethel left nothing of the sort. Their settlements simply ceased. Dr. Thorne's comprehensive analysis of over 24 known Ethel sites across the Great Basin and Rocky Mountain foothills reveals a consistent, unsettling pattern that defies conventional theories of collapse. The problem of perfect cessation at Site Nexus Ethel 7, the primary resonance center. The evidence points toward not a flight, but a deliberate closure. The entrances to the subterranean complex were not breached or naturally collapsed. They were systematically and structurally sealed. Massive boulders, too heavy for a handful of people to move, were rolled into place using what must have been sophisticated lever and fulcrum systems. The ventilation shafts were meticulously plugged with layers of mineral clay and solidified resin. The interior of the dwellings, surprisingly, contained very little, a stark contrast to the richness of the knowledge their society possessed. There was no accumulation of waste, no tools left behind, and crucially, no human remains. The absence of remains is perhaps the most powerful clue. No mass graves, no bodies within the sealed structures, and no forensic evidence of conflict. This suggests that the Ethel either suffered an instantaneous catastrophic event that vaporized them, or they undertook a premeditated migration or transformation that left the vast majority of their population unaccounted for. This perfect cessation has led to 3 dominant, but equally unsettling, theories regarding the shadow of the vanishing. Each theory attempts to reconcile the Ethel's intellectual superiority with their sudden erasure from the historical record. Theory 1. The cataclysmic failure, the unforeseen variable. This theory posits that despite their incredible ability to calculate and predict, the Ethel were ultimately defeated by an overwhelming natural disaster, an unforeseen variable too rapid or too massive for their tide calculus to account for. The primary suspect for this catastrophe is volcanism. Around 17,500 years ago, regions adjacent to the Ethel settlements were seismically active. A massive localized eruption, perhaps a smaller, regional caldera event, could have released an enormous cloud of volcanic ash. This ash, known as tephra, would not only choke the atmosphere, but also contaminate water sources and smother the mammoth steppe grasslands that supported the bison and mammoth herds, their primary food source. The argument: an ash cloud of sufficient density could lead to rapid starvation. However, given the Ethel's deep storage capacity and their mastery of subterranean living, they should have survived long enough to leave signs of desperation: scavenged remains, broken tools, or failed attempts at escape. The evidence does not support a slow, agonizing starvation. The end would have had to be instantaneous, perhaps a massive release of highly toxic volcanic gas, a localized carbon dioxide or hydrogen sulfide pocket that seeped into their sealed dwellings, suffocating the entire population simultaneously. The flaw: this still doesn't explain the lack of physical remains. If they suffocated in their homes, their bones would still be there, preserved in the stable, cool environments of the kinetic dwellings. The fact that the houses were empty of life suggests the disaster happened before the sealing, or that they moved after the disaster, which leads to the second theory. Theory 2. The calculated retreat, the silent migration. This theory suggests that the sages, using the tide calculus, foresaw the inevitable end of the Paleolithic refugia. The ice was receding, but the change was slow, leading to destabilization of the very mammoth steppe ecosystem they relied upon. More importantly, they predicted the arrival of the Clovis precursor cultures, less advanced, rapidly expanding hunter-gatherer groups filtering south. The Ethel realized that their philosophy of static harmony was incompatible with this new wave of humans. Their high-tech, low-impact society would be immediately disrupted by the aggressive, opportunistic hunting methods of the newcomers, leading to conflict that would violate their core principles. The argument, faced with a choice between philosophical compromise, war, resource competition, and extinction, the Ethel sages made the final, grand calculation, total, calculated withdrawal. They systematically dismantled their society, gathered every high-value artifact, the platinum-inlaid source stones, the best obsidian tools, and sealed their knowledge centers to prevent their sophisticated technology from falling into the hands of the less principled, chaotic newcomers. They then embarked on a silent, highly organized migration. Where did they go? The theory suggests Sioux routes, both offering isolation, the Deep South, a rapid, concealed passage into the extreme environments of Mesoamerica, perhaps becoming a hidden, deep jungle culture where their metallurgical knowledge was abandoned in favor of pure botany and philosophical pursuit. The subarctic retreat, a difficult, nearly suicidal trek north, back into the isolated, slowly receding ice perimeter, seeking the last pockets of stable cold environment. This is unlikely given their knowledge of climate trends, but fits the theme of ultimate isolation. The flaw, a civilization of thousands, possibly tens of thousands, cannot simply vanish without leaving any trail, no campsites, no distinct tools, no genetic marker in subsequent populations. The silence after $16,000 BP is absolute. Theory. 3. The transcendence event, the philosophical climax. This is the most compelling, yet scientifically challenging theory, arguing that the end of the Ethel was not a failure of survival, but the ultimate success of their philosophy. It ties directly back to the epoch of the Mind Tide. The Ethel were obsessed with non-entropy, the reduction of chaos, and the maintenance of perfect equilibrium. The sages, through the collective mental focus in the resonance centers, may have reached a point of philosophical and intellectual development where the physical body was deemed the final, most cumbersome source of entropy and disruption. The ultimate application of the tide. Calculus was the calculation of maximum efficiency of being, the argument. The Ethel realized that the only way to achieve truly static harmony was to withdraw completely from the physical world. The transcendence event was a calculated, synchronized, and intentional act of collective withdrawal, possibly induced through chemically induced state. Utilizing their profound botanical knowledge, they may have synthesized a rare, powerful compound, perhaps derived from a rare local fungus or root, which, when ingested in the resonance centers, caused a mass, peaceful cessation of biological function, calculated, communal, philosophical suicide, or a shift into a non-corporeal state. Physical encapsulation. A more fantastic, yet technically plausible, idea suggests that they used their unique understanding of geothermal energy and metallurgy to create some form of physical encapsulation, or stasis technology within the deep Earth, putting their entire civilization into a state of suspended animation, awaiting a future geological period more conducive to their ideals of static harmony. This would explain the meticulous sealing of the entrances. They were sealing their own tombs, chambers. The lack of bodies can be explained if the chemicals they used also accelerated decomposition, or if the encapsulation process involved a change in molecular structure. But the essence of the theory is that the Ethel did not die. They left. They chose perfect silence over imperfect survival. The shadow of the vanishing, therefore, is the shadow of a perfect choice. It is the echo of a civilization that looked at the future, calculated the impossibility of sustained, non-entropic life among the rising tide of chaotic humanity, and chose to exit the stage entirely. Their final act was to turn their backs on the messy narrative of history, preserving their philosophy in the profound sealed silence of the earth. The Ethel remain, 16,000 years later, America's deepest, most profound mystery, a whisper in the dust that tells us not only of a people who were, but of a knowledge so vast it led to their own beautiful, total, and terrifying disappearance. The silence they left behind is the most eloquent artifact of all.